Eye-catching clarity and product definition were the objects of this illustrative shot, designed and executed by Dean Collins. Entitled Levitation, this photograph has the look of expensive retouching, but the final image is actually completed on a single sheet of film, with the help of a little Collins magic.
We were originally commissioned by Calumet Photographic to shoot this particular shot for the cover of their catalog. So we had two things to overcome, you might say. First of all, we had to deal with a photographic product in a photographic environment to identify what's inside the catalog, to say that it is a photographic catalog. And secondly, we had to produce an image which was so interesting and so unique that people that make a living producing interesting imagery would want to look at it. That's where the neon concept came in, and the actual floating suspension aspect makes photographers inquisitive, like, gee, how was that done? So they would open the publication up and find out, the concept of what was inside the catalog.
Entering the Fine Light studio, assistant Kevin Scott Schumacher begins to set up for the first stage of this two-part shoot. An 8x10 camera is mounted on a tripod to act as a stand for the subject of this first exposure. The highly polished 360mm Kaltar lens is then set into place as Kevin begins the task of lighting the reflective surface. A triangular light box constructed of 3 Lightform P22 panels is set directly in front of the lens. 2 layers of translucent fabric create the main diffusion panel, while the 2 remaining panels contain the light and act as gobos. A bare bulb Pulso 4 strobe head is placed on a light stand and set inside the light box, facing away from the translucent panel. Because the inside of the box is lined with white reflective fabric, the strobe light will bounce off of the back of the box and produce a soft, even illumination on the panel. This bounce box approach to lighting highly reflective objects eliminates the problem of hot spots that may show up on the surface of the product. Lightform double clips are used to secure the back of the light box and contain the light. The strobe is connected to a Pulso 4 power pack, which Kevin sets to the appropriate power. Single clips are used to pull wrinkles from the diffusion fabric that may show up in the photograph due to the extreme specular resolution of the highly polished lens. With the basic setup complete, Collins rolls the phobostand into place with a 90mm lens on the 4x5 camera. The flat black wall will serve as a background for the photograph.
Clever kind of guy,
Collins then locks the camera stand into a solid position to begin his work. Working with a black product on a black background, a viewing hood is added to the 4x5 for viewing ease. Collins knows that his camera would not normally carry focus across the entire face of the lens, so he uses a swing on the camera. By utilizing this effect, the plane of focus can be shifted to the critical areas of the product that would otherwise fall out of the depth of focus. This is known as a Scheimpflug effect. Collins turns the Kaltar lens so the product name can be easily seen, and then checks his focus and the position of the lens on the ground glass. A white card is held behind the product lens for easy viewing as Collins adjusts the horizontal support arm on the camera stand for perfect positioning.
Perfect.
With the elements set in position, Dean directs his assistant Kevin to move the light box until the optimum specular coverage on both the metal rim and the glass element is achieved. Working from the final image, a highlight of the lens reveals the specular qualities that the large source of illumination provides.
Okay, Kevin, give me the end.
The studio lights are dimmed, so Collins can use a flashlight to make a final check of critical focus on the front and the back of the lens.
but I can't pick it up. Okay, Neil, put me on the back. Check the background right here.
An incident meter reading is then taken with the dome of the meter facing the light source, and Collins finds that he is more than 2 stops off of the f/45 reading he needs to carry focus. He increases the power to a full 3200 watt seconds.
Okay, can we just hold it, back it up
Next,
a little
a
bit.
Calumet exposure calculator, also known as a 2-inch rule, is held in the subject area to determine the bellows extension factor. The exposure ruler, which is placed on the ground glass to measure the image size, shows a 1 1/2 stop light loss. A second, more concise reading reads f/45, but with the 1 1/2 stop bellows factor, Collins must fire his strobe 3 times, which equals a 1 1/2 stop increase in light to retain his depth of field at f/45. An aperture of f/45 is dialed in on the 4x5. The camera is loaded with Polaroid for the first check print. The shutter will remain open while the Pulso power pack automatically fires the strobe 3 times and then resets itself for the next exposure.
Great.
Collins uses Polaroid 55 positive-negative film when shooting dark objects such as a lens. When backlit, this film shows greater detail in the blacks, enabling a photographer to see any problems in the darker areas of the film.
Just to give some shine to it. But I think if you would take the black felt, so just we're going to drop some reflectors right in here, and just to open up both those sides. Do you have the negative?
Dean also examines the Polaroid negative with a high-powered loupe to check for critical focus in the image.
Yeah, front and back's fine. Front's real sharp. Just a little tack out in the back.
Collins talks about lighting the highly reflective lens.
The actual, we'll call it framing lenses, the one top and bottom, were kind of difficult to record on film because they weren't going to have a neon around them. They weren't going to have their own shape separated out from the background. So we had to really produce what we'll call lighting contrast on them. There was tonal contrast on them. I mean, it's a black lens, and this black lens has white lettering, so you have black and white already there. But to create shape and roundness on this lens, we had to work with specularity, shine within the material. So working with the white the proper white reflective materials, silver reflective materials around it to create shine surface to show that it is a round lens, that it wasn't flat, was probably the most difficult thing about these 2 exposures. And we were so close to it. So we were in close. We're trying to carry depth of field from the front to the very back edge. So we had to work with the best camera movements possible, and we had to carry the maximum depth of field with our f-stops. We had to shoot it all at f/45.
After viewing the first check print, Dean decided that a black velvet bib was needed to cover the base of the lens. To create the needed specular highlights on the barrel of the lens, Collins uses tiny silver reflectors, which are small pieces of cardboard cut from a Polaroid box. By correctly placing the reflectors, specular highlights are created to add proper dimension and roundness to the barrel of the lens.
Who needs assistance anymore?
Now ready for his second check print, Collins will take the same exposure twice on the same sheet of film. The first exposure will place the image of the lens on one edge of the film. By removing the camera back and replacing it upside down, the second exposure will occur on the opposite side of the film. This will enable Collins to check the positioning of the lenses and that there will be sufficient space for the floating optic in the center of the photograph. The second check print is a success, and Collins will move on to prepare for stage 2 of the photograph.
Bring the Caltar back around.
With a small sheet of clear acetate attached to the ground glass of the camera, Collins traces the outline of the lenses to create a reference guide for the placement of the center lens. Dean Collins explains the technique of camera registration.
There's two ways of registering these images together. You can either have two cameras, separate setup, or you can have one camera with a very good studio stand. In this case, we use one camera with the FOBA. One thing about the FOBA stand is that everything has been marked out. Any movement, any placement, you'll see along this, you'll have every last millimeter has been marked out. So if you keep a documentation of where those are and you do not move the stand from the floor, you just move the camera around to another spot, you can, within a half a centimeter, bring it back into the exact position and line it up to where you can take one exposure and then move it around and put another exposure on the same piece of film without ever taking the camera off the stand and moving it around. It's a real quick way of produce precise registration between two images.
By noting the registration numbers on the camera stand and camera, Kevin creates a series of location points that will enable Collins to return to his exact position for the final exposures. With registration complete, the camera is swung to the opposite side of the studio to begin work on the second and most complex part of the photograph. Collins begins by switching from a bag bellows on the 4x5 to a standard bellows for use with a 210mm lens. 4 clamps are then used to secure a sheet of clear plexiglass to 2 light stands. Weights are added to each stand to ensure that the plexiglass will not move once set in place. Next, a threaded aluminum bar is bolted into a hole that was previously drilled in the center of the plexiglass. The plexiglass is then cleaned thoroughly for the photograph. With Kevin holding the lens, Collins carefully hot glues the lens to the end of the aluminum rod. By making sure the support rod is directly behind the lens from camera point of view, the effect of suspending the product is easily achieved. The glue can later be removed with Bestine, a common rubber cement solvent. An empty paint can filled with cement produces a simple studio stand that Collins uses to support a P15 panel with black fabric. The panel will act as a catch for the lens, just in case.
2 stands flat, and then we got to find our drape.
To create an overhead scrim for the lens, a P22 panel with 2 layers of translucent fabric is attached to 2 stands with EC1 clamps. Using a boom stand, Kevin positions a bronze-color strobe with a parabolic reflector directly over the lens. As Collins sets his shot, a white card is held behind the lens for contrast. A view through the ground glass reveals that the lens has been centered and is in position relative to the tracings from the previous set. 2 nylon curtains, one translucent and the other reflective, are suspended with double clips on elastic bungee cords to create a light tint. A diagram reveals that by keeping the curtains far enough away from the lens, reflections of the white curtains in the plexiglass can be avoided. Note the specular highlight on the side of the lens, created by the curtain that is now illuminated by a second strobe. Collins directs Kevin to back the strobe up, creating a larger light source and a less intense specular highlight, thus producing the proper ratio of the specular to the diffused highlight. By utilizing a symmetrical strobe system, the power of the modeling light from each strobe enables Collins to set the contrast by eye. Working from a previous incident reading, a test shot is made at f/45. Again, note the specular highlight created by the curtain, a relatively small source of illumination. As seen in the diagram, the second curtain acts as a reflector fill, providing detail to the right side of the lens, while the large overhead scrim creates a specular highlight on the lens, helping to identify surface qualities and the shape of the lens. Satisfied with the lighting for the first two exposures, Collins begins working on the background neon effect. A P22 frame secured to two light stands provides the foundation for a large sheet of opaque plexiglass held to the frame with utility clips. Black Savage background paper is then rolled down the face of the plexiglass and cut to size. Gaffer's tape is used to fasten the paper to the top and the bottom of the frame.
The most difficult part about this shot was produce the exact alignment of the neon effect around the floating lens. That was done by taking the back off of the camera, which was taking the picture, taking a hot light, aiming it through the optic which was going to record the lens, which then projected an exact silhouette of that lens onto a background which is about 6-7 feet behind it, which was an opal piece of plastic, a large piece of plexiglass covered with black paper. Then cutting out that silhouette, tracing out that silhouette and cutting it out gave us an exact alignment of where the neon would be. So during the final exposure, the actual neon effect was even all the way around the lens, and it wasn't off one side or the other. The alignment is probably the most difficult thing of any neon effect.
To produce an accurate silhouette of the lens on the background, Collins places a 650-watt quartz light directly behind the view camera. To protect the ground glass from heat damage, it has been removed and replaced with a sheet of Roscoe Lux Tough Frost, turning the camera into a projector of light. A change in aperture size directly affects the beam of light, as Collins controls the sharpness of the image, while Kevin works quickly to sketch the outline with a grease pencil.
Like that gives a sharp edge of where to do like that. See how it comes in sharper?
The traced area is then cut out of the paper, leaving the opaque plexiglass exposed. Double-stick tape is used to hold the edges of the paper down, producing a clean, accurate outline of the lens. Collins places a third Broncolor strobe on a stand and aims it directly at the back of the plexiglass cutout. A Roscoe Lux red gel is added, and Kevin turns the modeling on to check the effect. A diagram of the overall setup shows the relationship of each element that Collins used to create the suspended lens and neon effect. The distance from the 4x5 camera to the neon plexiglass is necessary to achieve a soft neon effect by throwing the background out of focus. The large sheet of plexiglass is needed to cover the angle of view of the 210mm lens. The next step is for Collins to choose the f-stop that will produce the desired neon effect for the second of two exposures.
8, 11, 16, yeah, it looks just, it's going to be real, okay, about f16 is what we're going to shoot that background color on. I think even the blue and the red would look fine at 16s. Yeah, it's just right neon. It's 8's just too much glow. I think it'll be real nice and tight neon.
Collins selects f16 to produce a clean silhouette of the foreground lens and the proper neon effect. Again, the distance from the camera to the plexiglass must be sufficient to throw the background out of focus at f16 to create a neon effect. Dean uses a booster 2 with his minolta to take a reflective reading of the neon directly off of the ground glass. This reading will establish the desired intensity of color relative to 18%. Through the choice of aperture for this second exposure, Dean selects a 2:1 red, or a 36% red. For those without the capabilities of a booster 2, a reflective receptacle reading can be just as effective, taken from the light coming through the plexiglass.
Value to the 10th of a stop. So yeah, there's no bellows at all in this thing. Check it again.
Dean Collins explains the control of colored backgrounds.
The glowing effect of neon is dependent on the aperture that the camera is set at when you take that picture. At f64, you're going to have a very in-focus glow, which the cutout paper looks like a cutout part. At say f8, it's going to be very out of focus and very, very neon. So depending on your aperture will depend on how much that neon effect behind the lens is going to be. Color zoning, chroma zones, is going to utilize the color control here. What we're going to do is if I take a reflective reading off of the ground glass with a booster 2 from Minolta, it's an attachment which goes to our Minolta 3. When you take a reading right off the ground glass, it gives you a reading to set your camera at to make that a middle tone value. In other words, 18% red in this case, or we'll say the value of 1. If we then make the reflective reading come off that reading something like f22, but we set our camera at f16, well, f22 is going to be twice as bright as 18%. We're going to say a 36% red or a 2 to 1 red. If we consider 18% 1, then we consider twice that a 2 to 1. The lens is being exposed with at f...
Collins prepares to take a test print to check exposure and registration of the neon. The first exposure of the lens is shot at f45 for maximum depth of field.
f16 for a 2 to 1 red. Let me cover this up so I don't show up in the reflection of that plex. Especially these chromium wires can show up so easily. Just about like that, just so I'm out of the frame. Okay, ready? Okay.
Kevin turns off the strobe surrounding the lens and reroutes the appropriate power to the background strobe for a 2 to 1 red. Collins adjusts the aperture to f16 for the second exposure. During the first exposure, black velvet was draped over the neon cutout to ensure total color saturation of the neon without contamination. Collins makes a second exposure of the neon only.
Super. All right.
Yeah.
Perfect. Just right there. We're going to have to shave it down. 16. Probably should shoot that at 11. I think we'll get a little bit better neoning.
After examining the Polaroid check print, Dean decides to open the aperture from f16 to f11 to create a slightly softer neon. By increasing the aperture, the power of the background strobe must be cut in order to retain the 2 to 1 red. Collins adds a Roscoe Lux one-stop ND gel to the background strobe to cut its power.
A problem with exposing two images onto one sheet of film is that you have two possible different exposures. So by running your test on two different sheets of film, expose one image on one sheet, one image on another, develop those two out, find out how far they are from each other in exposure, make sure that they are corrected at the time of their exposure, then you can expose both of those onto one sheet of film and guarantee it, when developed out, both of them have the exact exposure necessary.
Working for his final exposures, Collins makes 6 exposures of the suspended lens and neon on film and 2 on Polaroid without developing them. In this way, Dean can use the Polaroids to check registration of the remaining exposures from the first setup and be assured of perfect registration when he completes the images on film.
Yeah. Stay right there.
Now ready to add the final 2 exposures, Collins swings the phobostan back to the original marks and begins to reset for the shots, which completes the remarkable evolution of Levitation.
There was 2 difficult things about this shot. First of all, conceiving the shot, then doing it. The conception of the shot was really given my responsibility. I was hired by Calumet. They said, come up with the shot, you think it up for our cover to create an impact aspect. Many hours on airplanes, a lot of time on drawing board, sketching it out in my mind, until finally I came up with exactly what I wanted it to look like. Then coming up with the physiological restraints, the physiological laws I must follow to come up with the shot, especially when there's not going to be any airbrushing involved. I didn't want any airbrushing involved with this shot. I wanted it to be totally mine. So the proper suspension aspect, how to create a registered neon, how to get just a certain form around the lenses to where I had to separate black from black, meaning the black walls from the black lenses to create their full shape, and make sure the color value was right on the money was really, to me, this is what this was the biggest treat of my career, at least of here recent, is that they've given me an opportunity to show my stuff in front of other commercial photographers, to grab their attention, and to try to do it totally photographically, I think was one of the biggest challenges, and it worked. We're real proud of the cover. It's got a tremendous amount of attention, and it makes people open up their minds a little bit about saying, well, you know, I think I should possibly start working a little bit more with my brains instead of with retouchers doing a lot of the work.